Welcome to the Spectre of Communism. Who was Karl Marx, really?
A spectre is haunting Europe. The spectre of communism.
Communism is stronger, more determined than ever.
Communism.
A couple of months ago, the CrashCourse channel released a video called Who Was Karl Marx and Why Is Everyone Still Talking About Him?
You may have noticed people talking about Marxism lately.
The unchecked spread of Marxist influence.
As our nation has been taken over by the Marxists.
The demands of the anarchists and Marxists rampaging across America
Will threaten our very survival.
Okay, whoa, should I be alarmed? The Marxists are threatening my survival? It seems like our elected officials are pretty worked up about this. But what does Marxism actually mean?
If you don't know, CrashCourse is a popular YouTube channel made by the Green Brothers, which provides introductory educational videos about various topics from science to politics to history. And to help us talk about this video, and more importantly, answer the question of who Karl Marx was and what he stood for, we have with us Josh Holroyd. He's a regular on the show, and he's a leading member of the Revolutionary Communist International. Josh, it's great to have you on again.
Thanks, Joe. It's great to be here.
So, who was Karl Marx?
Karl Marx was a German philosopher and economist who was born in 1818. But above all, Karl Marx was a revolutionary who dedicated his entire life to the struggle for the liberation of the working class and for socialism.
And obviously this video isn't about Karl Marx's biography, and neither is the CrashCourse video. If you're interested in that, then there's plenty of books you can read and articles on Marxist.com that you can look into. We're here to talk about Marx's real legacy, which is his body of ideas and his contributions. But before we get into that, Josh, what did you think of this video by CrashCourse?
Well, what I liked was it was an attempt to explain Marx's ideas in as accessible terms as possible, for as wide an audience as possible. I agree with what the host said, that if we're going to discuss Marxism and Karl Marx, then we should have an honest discussion about what he really thought. What I didn't like is when CrashCourse actually tried to explain positively Marx's ideas, they got it wrong. Mm-hmm. Most of what is in that video, I would say, is a misrepresentation of what Marx actually thought.
Mm-hmm. And the purpose of this discussion is hopefully to do it better. So let's begin where they do, because they start in an appropriate place, in my opinion, which is with Marx's philosophy, Dialectical Materialism. Josh, could you maybe explain to us in an accessible but correct way what we mean by dialectical materialism?
Sure. And the first thing I'd like to say is nobody should be intimidated by the term dialectical materialism. Mm-hmm. Now, dialectical materialism, dialectics, will be unfamiliar to a lot of people. I had never heard the term dialectics before I encountered Marxism, and you get that with a lot of philosophical language, but you also get that with scientific language. Mm-hmm. Like when you start learning about biology and chemistry at school, you start encountering concepts and words that you'd never heard before.
Yeah. And we all now know that the mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell.
Exactly, yeah. Something that I noticed in the video is before the host is going to explain dialectical materialism, she has to prepare herself by drinking 20 coffees. And I understand that that's a joke, but I think there's a serious point in here that philosophy should be for everyone, no matter what their level of education actually. What is philosophy? Philosophy is thinking things over, reflecting on our ideas, trying to clarify our own ideas about things. Question the ideas that we receive from the rest of society, some of the assumptions that we encounter in the world in order to get a picture of the truth, to grasp the truth. And that obviously has an enormous significance for our lives. In political life, in our daily life, it can be an extremely powerful thing. The problem is, today, philosophy is associated with, I would say, so-called philosophers who deliberately make things obscure. And actually, they make their language and their philosophy obscure and difficult to understand because, frankly, there is nothing to understand in it. And often the message of philosophy today is all too often, there is no truth. You can't understand anything, so why bother? So I can understand why people are put off philosophy. But the great thing about Marxism is it's a philosophy designed to cut through all of that nonsense. And it's a philosophy, bear in mind that, as we mentioned before, Marx was a revolutionary. He wanted to, the thing that mattered to him the most was the struggle for the liberation of the working class. Therefore, he wanted his philosophy to be something that workers all over the world can pick up and use and discuss.
Engels described dialectics as our best working tool and our sharpest weapon.
Yeah, exactly. And that went by our. He's obviously talking about him and Marx, but he's also talking about the working class. And therefore, it's a philosophy that should be useful. And one other short comment about I'd make about that is that the time that we are living through right now is one in which so many of the assumptions and received ideas about how the economy works, how politics works, are crumbling. All of these things that we've been told for decades of the way the world works are being shattered by events. Mm-hmm. And so in the meantime, the establishment, the media, is constantly churning out either the same old story, which no longer makes sense, or is completely bewildered, or is lying to us constantly. So in times like these, in this snowstorm of events, to sit down and to start trying to think philosophically and work through things and get to the truth of the matter, I don't think has ever been more valuable, to be honest.
I totally agree. And I think that we should split the matter up, as CrashCourse does. Dialectical materialism. There's two parts to that. Let's start with dialectics.
Yep.
What do we mean by dialectics? Because I'll be honest, when I first heard the term, to me, it sounded like dialogue. It sounded like having a discussion.
Right. And you were right to think that. The term dialectics, it comes from ancient Greece, and it comes from the ancient Greek word from which our word dialogue comes. So originally, the dialectical method was often the presentation of an argument or a dialogue between two opposing viewpoints. Somebody would put forward a view of, I don't know, this is good, or the law is this. Somebody would put forward then an opposing view, and in the interaction and the debate, effectively, the dialogue between these two opposing views, there would come a higher understanding. Some of the mistakes or some of the gaps in the original conception put forward would be corrected in the process of that dialogue. The relevance this has to Marxism is that this dialectical process, this process of contradiction, is something that a philosopher that had a big influence on Marx, Hegel, who was mentioned in the video, Hegel took this dialectical idea and actually explained that not only can it come from the interaction between two opposing points of view, two different people, for instance, but actually even the development of a single idea takes place dialectically through this process of contradiction. What Hegel meant by this is that any idea is necessarily one-sided, that it contains, therefore, the potential for its own contradiction, that in the course of development, itself becomes false or it becomes something else. To give one example, life and death. Life and death are treated as opposites, aren't they? But death is a necessary part of life. Life becomes death. Any organism, like we will die. We might be killed by some external factor, if a tree falls on us or whatever. Hopefully that won't happen to anybody watching this podcast. But if none of those unfortunate accidents happen to us, no external force has killed us, still by virtue of the process of our life, we will cease to exist. That actually applies to all things and all ideas. And from this, Hegel said that this contradiction, this negation, doesn't destroy the original idea or the thing. Actually, it leads to the creation of new forms. And so what's important here is that all things in the universe are in a constant process of development. Nothing is fixed, static, self-contained, or pure. Everything is constantly evolving and interacting with everything else. What does that mean for our philosophical method? It means that we can't take our ideas as fixed, perfect, complete. We have to go to reality as it presents itself to us. We have to go into the world, dive into the subject matter that we're trying to understand, and from that, draw out generalizations and conclusions that can help us delve a bit deeper, but never assume that those generalizations are perfect and self-contained. All of our definitions and our categories are constant works in progress because reality is itself constantly evolving. You can see that with people. A full-grown person is not a giant baby.
It depends on the person, I would say.
In the main, a full-grown person is physically and psychologically not at all the same as a baby. And yet, I am I am the same person. I'm the same individual that I was when I was born, and yet I am also so different. And I've gone through many different transformations in the course of my development. You can see that process in the history of the natural world, in the formation of our planet, of the development of life itself. And you can see it, and this is something Marx focused on a lot, you can see it in the development of human history as well. That human society has not just always been the same relations, the same institutions, but on a smaller scale, or a more primitive or whatever. And then and capitalism is basically just the same society that we had 10,000 years ago, but on a bigger scale.
I think Marx even criticised the so-called Robinson Crusoe thought experiments that some of the bourgeois philosophers of his day, the capitalist philosophers and economists of his day, presented, where they basically implied that that they took the story of Robinson Crusoe, where a man from what was then the modern world washes up on an island and basically creates a little militarized version of the world he came from. And the capitalist philosophers and economists of Marx's day said, well, how capitalist society looks is basically just some reflection of human nature, right? And if we were left alone on an island, we just recreate capitalism on a smaller scale.
Yeah, that's such a common idea. It was a common idea back in Marx's day, which he critiqued, as you were saying. But even today, the way that people talk about capitalism is that it is an eternal system. As long as you have human beings, they will be inherently greedy. It's probably an idea that we've all heard. That this inherent greediness somehow translates to wanting to produce things for a market and make profit, even though for the vast majority of human society, there hasn't been a market or profit. But somehow there was this urge to be capitalist that has only been realized with the development of society. Actually, I mean, we can talk about this in more detail, but as Marx identified, that is not the case. That capitalism is a human society, just like what existed before, obviously, but it represents a huge, the birth of capitalism, which wasn't that long ago, we're talking centuries ago, not thousands of years ago. The birth of capitalism was a huge transformation of the human society that existed before. It's itself only one form in the evolution of human society.
So is it fair to say that looking at the world in a dialectical way has necessarily revolutionary implications?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say to bring this back to, well, what does all this mean for our for our political life or the way we interact with the world? Dialectics, above all, is a scientific outlook because of what I said earlier about trying to find truth and draw our generalizations from reality itself and constantly take those generalizations and ideas and not force reality to fit them, our scheme that we've come up with by logical deduction, but actually to constantly enrich and develop our ideas with reality and with this constantly evolving reality. But flowing on from that, just as you said, it's inherently revolutionary, and it's a revolutionary method that drives us to revolutionary conclusions. Why? Because dialectics boldly declares that everything that currently exists will one day come to an end. That everything comes into being, it develops, and then it passes away, giving birth to some new form. So all of the institutions we currently live under in human society, they have an origin which we can study and we can understand. They have a development, they have gone through a series of transformations, but those transformations aren't random or externally imposed, like we were talking about with life and death. They actually come about as part of the necessary development of the things we're talking about. These social transformations have come about as a result of the lawful development of society itself. And therefore, what we can conclude is that the institutions we live under today, like the market, like the state, will one day not exist. They are not an inherent and permanent part of our human nature. And that, of course, that can't help but lead you to revolutionary conclusions.
All right, so that's dialectics. How about materialism? Because the way the video puts it is that Marx thought you could understand everything through economics. And if you wanted to, I think the way they put it is, if you want to understand religion or culture in a given society, you look at the way that wages are paid. Yeah, and that is a real oversimplification, which is often used to hit Marx over the head with, or hit Marxists today over the head with, when actually what Marx was saying is a much richer idea, and it offers
a great deal of understanding about the world that we live under. First of all, on materialism, again, talking about the association that people have with words. I don't know if you've encountered this, but often if I talk about materialism, meaning materialist philosophy, people tend to assume that I'm talking about greed or liking the material things in life, wanting lots of money and that kind of thing.
Whereas an idealist is someone who is inspired by big ideas and they've got their head in the clouds, but they're ultimately well-meaning and they're driven by higher principles.
Exactly. Materialism is presented as basically being out for yourself, being a bad thing. Mm-hmm. That's not at all what we're talking about. That's actually a deliberate misrepresentation. Intended to attack materialist philosophy going back hundreds of years. We don't need to go into that now. I'll just explain what materialism is to us, what philosophical materialism is to us. It is the belief that there is nothing outside of matter, the material universe. And the development of matter and the material universe does not require some external agent. It does not depend on consciousness, either our minds and our consciousness, to make it what it is, or a divine creator. Again, it's a scientific outlook that Marx based himself on. Now, the comment that is made about understanding everything through economics is obviously referring to human society. Briefly, I'd mention that Marx didn't just apply materialism to society. He also had a materialist outlook when it came to the natural world as well. But his philosophy is broader than just society. But in his theories about society, what materialism meant, sometimes it's referred to as historical materialism. You'll see that term around. What that meant is that we, rather than basing our understanding of our social world, of society, on the various ideas that have emerged in history about how things should be, such as ideas of, well, this is human nature, or this is how the family should work. Marx based his understanding of how society is developed on real individuals, real living individuals and their material conditions and their real life. Marx talks about the sensuous life of real individuals in the world. And so what does that mean? The most basic aspect of all our life is obtaining the necessities of life so we can keep going. There's that famous saying that man begins to philosophize when his needs are met. And so Marx, when he looked at the life, the basics of society, both he and Engels, when they were writing together, insisted that we want to look at the activity, the real life activity of real living individuals, which can be studied empirically. Mm-hmm. So they weren't trying to build castles in the sky or, develop ideas of how society is because we say it must be logically. Let's actually study what people do.
And we should say very quickly, Marx wasn't the first socialist thinker, right? There were others who did spend a lot of time thinking about what a perfect society should look like and how the world should be, rather than beginning with the premise of how men and women were actually living.
And Marx read those people at that time, and I mean, he praised quite a lot of their criticisms of capitalism as it existed, but their main failing was they thought about, well, what is the perfect human society? This is my idea of what human beings are, and human beings therefore needs these certain things, and I'm going to draw you, in some cases literally draw a diagram of how they should live so they can all be happy. That's obviously that's going to crash against the rocks of reality. Marx, in keeping with this dialectical method that we just talked about, let's look at how people live their lives. And the most important thing that he identified in this real sensuous life of individuals is labor. So when people talk about everything is determined by economics, what Marx is getting at is that humanity itself, even the origins of Homo sapiens as a species, can be found in our interaction with nature. Our transformation of our natural surroundings in order to produce and obtain the things we need to survive. The production of tools, such as stone tools, in the early period of our existence. When you create a flint hand axe, you are transforming your external natural surroundings in a way in which you can control nature that little bit more, and therefore use that to whatever, obtain meat, and therefore meet your needs. This is at the basis of all human life. I know that under capitalism today, so many people, their job, if they work a desk job, they're not out hunting and gathering, or they're not even farming the fields. So maybe it's easy to think that the production of the necessities of life is something that just takes care of itself. But it doesn't. Capitalism is also founded on production, first and foremost. But one thing that Marx also explained is that, a bit like the Robinson Crusoe example you gave, but the opposite, that when we talk about human beings and labour, it's not just an individual process, that we all live on islands and we all create our own individual economy. That's never been the case throughout the whole history of humanity. We've always been social animals. And so our production, our transformation of nature, our creation of things like tools has always been a social process. And Marx makes the point that in the process of this social production, individuals necessarily establish relations independently of their will. They might have ideas about these relations. They might discuss it. They might think it's a good thing or a bad thing. But certain relations of production that are necessary to actually get the product, the result that they're looking for, emerge and evolve. Marx has this great expression where he says that man makes himself. That in transforming nature, we also transform our nature. Why? Because we have to develop new relations and institutions. You see that with things like the introduction of agriculture. The introduction of agriculture and farming didn't just increase the productive capacity of human society, it completely transformed the way people lived. The transition from the nomadic way of life to a settled way of life, something we take for granted, was massively accelerated by agriculture. Likewise, religion was affected by that.
Yes.
The kind of spirits or gods that people worshipped and the way that they worshipped them was affected. To give you an example, this isn't as ancient as what I was just talking about, but I don't know if anybody's ever visited the Mayan ruins in, well, a number of places. I visited them in the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. And one thing that struck me is that so many of these really grand, amazing temples have little faces in the corners, and it's all the same god, the god Chak, who was the rain god. Clearly, this god was particularly important to the people living there at that time. It just so happens that the Yucatan Peninsula doesn't have any rivers at all. It has underground water sources, but rainwater was extremely important. It was literally a life and death question for the people living there. So they worshipped a number of gods, but one important god that they worshipped was the god of rain. Now, that's not reducing everything to wages or to the economy. That is people developing ideas, ideologies, religions about their real life and their real needs. I think that is a very, dare I say, even a common sense idea. There are other examples as well of the same phenomenon, that Christianity emerged, for instance, in the Roman Empire, but it was particularly popular and eventually became dominant in the cities and amongst poor people, dispossessed people and slaves in the cities. It was a mainly urban religion when it first started out. The term pagan comes from pagans being the people who worship the old gods. The term pagan came from the Greek word for peasant.
Yes.
Because it was more prominent in the countryside where people were living the old way. So changes in people. Now, that doesn't mean that every single belief of Christianity, like the Trinity, is just directly determined by what it's like to live in a city. Otherwise, everyone who lived in a city at that time would become Christian. That's not what happened. But we can see the impact on your material conditions and the way you live on religion. I don't want to just list examples, but another important example is obviously Christianity itself has changed over time. There are lots of different forms of Christianity. One particularly famous form is Protestantism, which emerged roughly 500 years ago. It, again, emerged in particularly the urban population, not only, but one of the major questions in this split between what became the Protestant Church and Catholicism, the older form of Christianity, was whether you can read the Bible in your own language. Can I read it in English? Can I read it in German, as opposed to Latin, which is how it had always been? The reason that became an issue about 500 years ago and not from the very beginning or 1,000 years ago is because you had more people who were literate, who spoke their own common language, like German, and those people tended to be urban, educated, artisans or craftspeople or intellectuals, people part of the class that was referred to as the bourgeoisie. Whereas Catholicism and the interpretation of the Bible only in Latin was a preserve of the old church, the clergy who were educated to read Latin and were part of the social institutions of the existing feudal order. In other words, this religious revolution and struggle, which was about more than just what I've talked about, but at its core, you can see a struggle between different social classes who live in different material conditions. This is what Marx is getting at. It's not reducing everything to the level of wages. One other thing I'd say on the level of wages is one phenomenon that I've seen going on is I think what's called the prosperity gospel. That in a number of countries, a form of evangelical Christianity is becoming very popular, which says that good things, lucky things will happen to you, like finding a £20 note on the floor if you do certain things, if you pray enough. It's becoming particularly popular amongst poor people in countries like Brazil and Nigeria. It's not so popular amongst wealthy people living in London. Why? Because it reflects the needs and desires and material conditions of the people subscribing to that form of Christianity. It's, if you like, in that sense, it is linked to the level of wages on that example, but it's a much deeper idea than just reducing everything to the level of GDP or the level of wages. Marx never argued that. It's production.
So just to cap off this part of the video, I'd like to read a fairly lengthy quote, but a brilliant one, in my opinion, from Marx's Critique of Political Economy, which summarizes the essence of the unique contribution he makes to philosophy. He writes, "In the social production of their existence, men inevitably enter into definite relations which are independent of their will, namely, relations of production appropriate to a given stage in the development of their material forces of production. The totality of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society, the real foundation on which arises a legal and political superstructure, and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness. The mode of production of material life conditions the general process of social, political, and intellectual life. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness."
Yeah, it's a brilliant quote. And just to bring it back to what we were talking about, this is materialism. This is what Marx is getting at. That ideas don't exist independently of the human beings living in the real world and in certain social relations, having to produce the needs of life. What are our ideas about? What are we thinking about? Thinking about life and the world, the real world as it exists. That is materialism. That rather than proceeding from an idea of what society is or what it's supposed to be, we proceed from society as it really exists. And the power of this as a philosophy to start understanding things. It's not simply reducing religion or political ideas to, a numerical figure like the level of GDP or the level of wages. It's looking at the development of consciousness and culture in an historical way that can actually, by understanding the material foundations for things, we can actually understand why people have thought that at that time. Why is it that new religions emerged? Why is it that ancient religions still exist today, when society has changed so much? These are questions that finally we can begin to answer, whereas before we just have to take them on face value.
So I think that some people watching and listening might now be asking how we get from looking at the world in this way to the need for the working class to organize itself and to overthrow the existing capitalist order and build socialism. So why is Marx interested in class, in social classes? Why does he put such an emphasis on class struggle? How do we get from dialectical materialism as a way of viewing the world to this focus on class and class conflict?
That's a really good question. And the beginning of the answer can be found in what we were talking about before, about these social relations of production that inevitably arise out of the needs of production, the needs of life, and they also arise independently of the intentions or wills of the actual individuals concerned. That Marx emphasizes class because it's something that at a certain stage inevitably arises out of the development of production itself. With the origin of class society, sections of the population that live off the surplus and off the labour of the majority, of other people, that necessarily creates an opposition. It doesn't mean that society is permanently in constant war with itself. Otherwise, society it wouldn't last very long. But that tension, you look at society as a whole. Again, we shouldn't think of things as complete and self-contained. When you look at a society today, you're actually looking at several different social classes with different material interests that are necessarily opposed to one another. And that opposition, going back to dialectics, that opposition between the classes actually drives further progress.
So you talked about the emergence of class society and about the interaction between social classes. Can you just explain that a little bit more? Because we do have other videos dealing with this question, but I don't think we've dealt with it head on in this discussion so far. Why do humans divide into social classes? At what point did that happen and for what reason?
Right. Yeah, I agree with you. It's important that we tackle this because I've seen quite a few ideas, prejudice even, about this question. One is that actually there have always been classes, that you've always had people who were stronger or smarter than other people, and those people always had more than the rest. That is not true, basically. First of all, that's not what classes are. It's not the smartest and the strongest people get the upper hand over the rest. But also, the more we learn about our very ancient past, the less we see evidence of class society and social classes. That tens of thousands of years ago, when people were living by hunting and gathering, living a nomadic existence, we don't see any evidence for what we know as the state today. We don't see any evidence of slavery or the exploitation of one section of the population by the other. Mm-hmm. It's not. I'm not suggesting it's a paradise, but it is a form of society which is a lot more equal between men and women as well, and in family relations, but equal economically. That the level of surplus product that those societies were able to produce is relatively very low.
And by surplus product, we mean more than the people living in those groups, in those societies, need to survive.
Yeah. To give you an example, up until recently, as late as even as the 1960s, people living in the central Australian desert, which is obviously a hostile climate, they would hunt together in small groups, a handful of people. Whatever they found, even if it was a small creature like a small lizard, they would share that up equally amongst all of the hunters. Why was that? That in their culture, it was considered that was the right thing to do. We share. But some people think, that's just because some societies just had the idea that sharing is caring, that we need to be nice to each other. Mm-hmm. The reason that sharing ethic was so strong in that society is if one of the hunters starve, if every time somebody found something, they immediately consumed it themselves, then some in the hunting group would get hungrier and hungrier and weaker, maybe even starve to death, which ends up weakening the entire hunting group. And they're supposed to be bringing food back for the wider community. That communism, that communist ethos of no exploitation, of no private ownership of the means of production, so the wealth of society, and that sharing was a necessary product of what those communities needed for survival. Now, I'm not suggesting that all societies tens of thousands of years ago are identical to people living in the Australian desert today. Geographic conditions, what there is to hunt, the quantity of resources out there obviously have an impact. But what we don't see is masters and slaves, lords and serfs like under feudalism, and wage workers like today. That comes after and thousands of years after the introduction of agriculture. It doesn't come immediately after agriculture. But the significance of agriculture is that with the development of agriculture and farming in what's called the Neolithic Revolution, call it 10,000 years ago, it now becomes possible, especially the more that productive techniques and tools develop, things like irrigation are introduced, it becomes more and more possible to produce a regular, sustainable surplus. So a surplus of grain, for instance. And then the question arises, what do you do with that surplus? it's not all just immediately consumed by the people in that society. We have evidence. I'm not just coming up with this idea. We have evidence of more storage, for instance, grain storage. We also have evidence that this surplus product was being used to. It was not just a question of having more resources to go around, but also time. That if you have enough to feed a section of the population that don't actually have to work the fields, they can do other work, more mental labour, you might say, or intellectual labour. At a certain stage, thousands of years ago, call it about 6,000 years ago, we can find evidence in Iraq in particular is the example I'm thinking of, what is now Iraq, of temple structures in the settlements where a section of the population were working now as priests, that they were actually playing a productive role, that we have evidence to show that the priests were helping to plan where irrigation ditches should be dug, where new land should be drained. And so they were playing a role in helping to direct production. It's famous that the Egyptian priests were the ones who predicted the flooding of the Nile. That was a really important role in production they were playing. But they're no longer working in the fields. That gives them a certain privileged position. And this division between mental and manual labour, which did not exist in that form before, lays the material basis for eventually the exploitation of one section of the population by another. It's after this that we eventually start seeing the city-states in places what's called Sumer, which is in southern Iraq, in Egypt, and eventually a division in society between a privileged elite of scribes. This is when writing develops in order to account for and plan the surplus and production. Writing at the time was considered something magic and powerful, and it was almost exclusively in the hands of the priests and the bureaucrats that worked for the temple. You can see how with this privileged position in society, it's possible to amass more wealth, more power. So you have a division between the temple bureaucracy in these cities and then the mass of peasants who initially would have been voluntarily giving grain and bread and so on to sustain these priests because they're part of their society, they're playing a role. But eventually that relation is no longer, if you like, a democratic or voluntary sustaining of one section of the population for the sake of society as a whole. It is something that is expected, is demanded, is collected by force. And we have records of the time where different parts of the countryside have been allocated a certain quota of product that they have to give. But this necessarily produces a struggle. Society has become divided against itself. Society as a whole has become more productive, more wealthy, but it's become divided against itself between the minority and the majority. And we also see evidence of a struggle, a violent struggle breaking out within these societies. Many of the city-states that I'm referring to in this example, around 3000 BC, so about 5,000 years ago, they collapse, and a couple of hundred years later, they actually come back. But this time, we not only see evidence of temples, we also see evidence of palaces which did not exist before. Who lives in the palace? A king. So before that time, these powerful warrior kings that we are led to believe have always existed. They've always been strong, dominant, aggressive men who want to conquer and rule over society. That's why we have the state. That's why we have monarchs. That's not true. Monarchy is a relatively recent development in human history. The vast majority of human history, there was no monarch, there was no king. This state emerges out of this struggle between the classes. The state is an instrument used to hold down the majority, the oppressed and exploited majority, to maintain the stability of this society based on classes. This became, I hesitate to say the model, because it wasn't a deliberate blueprint that people were passing over. But as I think we all know, because we live under this system, these states, what we call civilization, class society, has become the dominant way of life for all people. And that's because it was more productive. The control of production by a ruling class allowed for the development of science, mathematics, writing. It came with a huge amount of destruction and the oppression of the majority, but it has also led to the economic development that we experience today. And so Marx identified this struggle between the classes. Once classes have emerged, he identified this struggle as an absolutely essential part of human progress. The brief description of very ancient class societies I've just given, I think people already can tell that's not how we live now. We're not ruled by a temple bureaucracy. Capitalism is based on the market, unlike these societies. You also have had in the past societies based on slavery, like in ancient Rome. You have societies based on private, individual powerful landlords owning great swathes of land and then having the local peasants forced to work on their land, pay rent. In the feudal system, different forms of class exploitation have emerged. And when we look at how these different forms of transition one to another, it hasn't been a nice, gentle, gradual evolution. It hasn't been an automatic process where as soon as you have some new form of technology, it immediately just becomes a new society. But as production has developed, it's led to the creation of new classes or the strengthening of one class materially over another. And in the struggle between those classes, revolutions, social revolutions have completely transformed the way that society works. The origin of capitalism is rooted in that. Capitalism is not that the market has always been inherently good, and more people said, oh, we should just produce for the market. Or Adam Smith came along and told everyone it's a good idea to invest in production and make a profit. That capitalism came about as a result of a bloody struggle between classes, a struggle between the bourgeoisie, this urban class of craftsmen and so on, struggling against the oppression that they suffered under feudalism, but also a struggle of the landowners to steal the land of the peasants living and working there, what happens to the peasants after their land has been stolen?
They starve to death, I suppose.
Or they have to walk around looking for work from whoever will give it them. So this without the development of technology to employ these people as workers, then they would have starved to death or had to find some other way of living. But at that time, roughly 500 years ago, this pushing of the peasants out of the land drove them into what would become manufacture. It was a huge factor in the creation of capitalism. And so when Marx says all hitherto existing society, by which he's talking about class society for the last 5,000 years, is a history of class struggles, what he's getting at there is we cannot understand historical development and we cannot understand politics and the state unless we look at the class forces and the class interests underpinning those ideas and those institutions.
So why did Marx throw behind the working class, the proletariat? Why did he identify the working class as the revolutionary class destined to transform society to its next stage? As you mentioned, the working class is a layer of society that owns nothing. It has no property. All it has to sell is its ability to work. What about that makes the working class revolutionary?
Yes, this fact that the workers don't own anything themselves and they have to work for somebody else. It is very important because all of the social revolutions that I briefly talked about in the past have tended to be revolutions of one property-owning class against another. So when I talked earlier about the transition from feudalism to capitalism, for example, the bourgeois living in the towns, they owned their means of production, is an expression that Marx uses. They owned their tools. Some of them became very wealthy, merchants and so on.
To be clear, another term which can be a bit off-putting or daunting is mode of production or means of production. These things in of themselves aren't that complicated, right?
Yeah, I think people can really overthink it. Mode of production means way of production, way of producing. Mm-hmm. That is literally what it means. And so when Marx is talking about a mode of production, he's talking about a set of relations, productive relations, on the basis of a certain level of technological development. Mm-hmm. So with the capitalist mode of production, what he's talking about is wage workers, people who don't own anything except their ability to work, selling their ability to work to a capitalist who owns machinery, producing for the market. He's talking about this set of relations on a certain level of economic, of technological development.
And that machinery, those tools, those factories, those premises, they're all means of production.
The factories, the machinery in those, the tools, they're means of production. The stuff that is used to produce with. The worker is the person doing the producing. Mm-hmm. You've reminded me. Another word that can be off-putting to people is bourgeoisie, partly because it's very difficult to spell. Maybe you can have it written on the screen when we're discussing this.
We'll spell out the word bourgeois across the screen.
But and another term that Marx uses, proletariat. And these are terms that he's taken from history. And when today we talk about the bourgeoisie, we're talking about the capitalists. That's the possessors of capital. It could be a sum of money which they invest and employ other people to work for them, and then they get the profits. They get the proceeds. That is what we mean by the bourgeoisie. It comes historically. The name originally means somebody who lived in a town, talking centuries ago under feudalism. Today, what we're talking about is the capitalist class. The proletariat, if you hear Marxists talking about the proletariat, they mean the working class. That means people that don't own any property, they don't own their means of production, and they have to sell their ability to work to somebody else. And again, the term comes from ancient Rome, referring to people who didn't have any property. That's the origin of the term.
And again, what makes the proletariat so great? What is the reason that we support the proletariat? Are they just better people? I mean, we had a video a couple of weeks ago where Jordan Peterson says that Marxism and communism are completely utopian and absurd because we used to assume that if the working class was in charge rather than the bourgeoisie, rather than the capitalists, then there's no reason to assume that they'd be any nicer or kinder or more decent. We just assume that the proletariat, for no good reason, are better people than the capitalists. Is that the reason we support the proletariat? Because we think they're better people?
I mean, this is Jordan Peterson is a good example of an idealist approach, basically taking some idea of people are nice or not, and then trying to impose it on history. It's also obviously famously dishonest as well. But when Marxists talk about a progressive class, like this is what we're getting at, that the working class is the progressive class, the revolutionary class. We don't mean that every individual worker is a really nice person, or that they have revolutionary ideas and that they are constantly, consciously trying to overthrow the capitalist system. We're talking in objective terms about the material necessity and material conditions of that class. I'll explain what I mean by that. Mm-hmm. Before the development of capitalism, the working class didn't really exist. You had some people who would work occasionally for wages, maybe someone who would work their own land, but then they would be paid to work on somebody else's during harvest time or something like that. And you had individuals who, I guess, lived in a similar way to workers today, but they were a minority, a small minority. The vast majority of the population lived on the land or owned their own means of production, like they were a self-employed artisan, like a carpenter or a potter living in the cities. It's only with the development of capitalism that you have this huge class and a rapid expansion of the number of people who own nothing. But it's not just that they don't own anything, it's that what are they doing? When they're going and selling their ability to work, Marx used the term labour power, but they go and sell their ability to work to the capitalist. They've been brought into these big capitalist establishments. They're not working in the same way that people were working centuries ago. They are working in large plants, today largely automated as well, a high level of technology. They are working often in large numbers in a coordinated, planned way within the workplace. And they are also being exploited in the same way. That workers have a common interest. Their conditions of production lead them towards collective organisation and collective planning, collective action. And the tendency under capitalism is to create a larger and larger working class. Why is that? If you're a capitalist and you want to start producing, you want to build a new factory, you need workers for that factory. And so this sounds like that I'm trying to make a purely logical argument. The evidence is there that over the last 100 years, the proportion of the world's population who are working class has grown and grown and grown. Now, about an absolute majority of the world's population are working for somebody else in the cities in particular. That Capitalism by itself, and this is an evidence of dialectical development actually. Capitalist production, Marx says that capitalism is creating its own gravediggers because it's creating a larger and larger class that in many countries already is a big majority, and on a world scale is rapidly becoming a big majority, who are exploited by a minority. And by exploited, we mean they are working and not getting the profit from that. The profit goes to the capitalist. They're being paid as little as the capitalist can get away with paying them, effectively. They are thrown together in these big establishments. They are having to. They don't work individually. They're not in competition with each other in the workplace. And not only that, but the nature of capitalism is constantly trying to drive them down. And so, what Marx is talking about is that workers, and again this has been proven by experience, workers necessarily, by their conditions of life, are driven into struggle against this system. And that, again, it's not just some philosopher saying this must happen because I've deduced it from this, that, and the other. Marx was drawing conclusions from his own experience in his own lifetime. He saw lots and lots of different workers' movements, particularly in England, where the working class was largest and most developed. He followed the political and economic struggles of the working class, from which he drew general conclusions which have been completely confirmed. That first of all, in order to defend and improve their working conditions and wages, workers will band together in what we know of as trade unions and organise and fight collectively to try and improve their conditions. That having struggled against an individual boss in the factory, more and more workers across the country, on a national scale, across entire industries, will recognise their common interest. And we see sector-wide unions, national federations and confederations of unions that are no longer just fighting against one specific boss, but now fighting against all the bosses in a sector or even the entire capitalist class nationwide. We see in the history of the working class a point that Marx drew out, that out of this economic struggle between the classes, which necessarily arises out of the character of capitalist production itself, the workers start to draw more general political conclusions. The struggle for the vote for working class people, that was a political conclusion drawn by the conditions that workers were forced into. The question of the workers having to, the idea that the workers should run society, that the government should be run by workers, becomes increasingly common. That's what the ideas of socialism are still being talked about now, because it reflects the conditions that people live under capitalism. And so from that, Marx is saying that the workers are the class that can create a new society because they have the interest in doing so, because they're dispossessed, because they're exploited. But unlike other classes, they also have the means to do so. What are the means? It's the workers that do all the work. Under capitalism, the capitalists don't go and work in the factory. Often they don't even design the products. It's workers, either people carrying out manual labour, intellectual labour, or any combination of the two. It's the working class that makes everything run in the society. It's the workers in various industries that know how to do things, how to produce efficiently, how to make the things that we need. And so the workers, yes, they have an interest in struggling against capitalism. Increasingly, when you see the history of the class struggle, especially in periods of crisis, that explicitly socialist and revolutionary ideas become popular amongst the working class. Yes, they have an interest, they also have the means to do it. So it's Marx is identifying an objective character in the working class. It's not just that we think they're great people. And the significance of the workers not having any property, meaning in the means of production, is that if the workers do succeed in taking power and transforming society in accordance with their interests, as the capitalist class have done in the past, they won't be doing it as property owners. That the working class, in order to take power, will have to seize the property of the capitalists collectively. And having done so, having taken hold of having dismantled the oppressive state apparatus of the ruling class, seized the technology and means of production developed under capitalism, bearing in mind that workers already from their conditions work collectively and in a planned way, what Marx says is that the workers, they won't suddenly parcel out all the property and turn themselves into new capitalists. their transformation of society in accordance with their interests will be along communist lines, meaning the absence of private property. In other words, a democratically planned economy to meet the needs of all.
Something else that occurred to me when I watched this video, and I just double-checked the transcript to make sure that I wasn't wrong about this, they mentioned that Marx didn't write an awful lot about how he wanted society to look. He didn't go into a huge amount of detail about how a socialist or communist society would look, but he does talk a lot about capitalism. However, at no stage does the video talk about the crisis of capitalism. It doesn't talk about overproduction. It doesn't talk about the fact that capitalism inevitably goes into crisis and why that is and how that relates to the struggle of the working class.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because it's not just, as I've explained, that the workers are exploited. That is true. But if the workers are exploited and capitalism was just constantly getting better and better and stronger, the system, it would be more easy for the system to stabilize itself. But I mean, I think all of us can see around us that that's not the case, that capitalism is an unstable system, that it goes through periods of upswing and development, and it also goes through periods of crisis. Yeah, when Marx talks about overproduction, like what does this mean, overproduction? He explains, trying to put it in as accessible terms as possible, that under capitalism, all the different capitalists and companies are selling on a market. They're necessarily in competition with other capitalists. And an important way in which they compete with one another is by trying to produce as much as efficiently as possible and drive down costs so they can sell a similar quality of product at a cheaper price. And then they'll get a bigger section of the market and maybe drive their competitors out of business. So what that creates is these contradictory pressures, where on the one hand, there's no plan about how much the market can actually soak up of all these different products. So different car manufacturers are trying to produce as many cars as cheaply as possible to throw them on the market. At the same time, that in order to make their products cheaper, they're also trying to drive down the wages of the people working for them. Now, the workers make up a very large chunk of the market. So it's the restrictedness of the market. Because let's not forget, the market is not all the needs that people have. Capitalist production is not producing things to meet the needs of real human beings. It is trying to serve what's called effective demand. It's effective demand because they've got the cash to pay for it. So it's not just that people want things, it's that they can afford to pay for it. So it's the restriction of that market versus the endless drive to produce as much as possible under capitalism. Means that you end up with goods that simply cannot be sold, and companies that have borrowed lots of money in order to expand production that can now no longer pay back their debts. And in Marx's day, you had crises where lots of businesses were going bust, lots of workers were thrown out of employment, and you still have crises like that today. But today we also see the huge expansion of credit and therefore debt to try and overcome this crisis. That actually goes quite some way to explaining the huge levels of debt and therefore also of austerity as states are trying to maintain their financial stability that we live under today. So this idea of Marx is not just something that made sense in the 19th century, it's something that is just an inherent part of capitalism today that we can never escape. One other thing that I would mention is, right at the beginning of this discussion when we were talking about dialectics, I mentioned that all things come into being, they have a period of development, and then eventually they pass away. They are transformed into something else. They enter into decline, they die. You see that with social systems, and you can see that with capitalism as well. That the depth of the crisis, the levels of barbarism that humanity is being dragged into by the continuation of this society, the system, gets worse and worse on a bigger and bigger scale. You look at the horrors of the Second World War, that all this capitalist development had brought the world to that, just to cling on to the maintenance of this system. The capitalist class relied on things like fascism, imperialist war. All of these things have a huge impact on consciousness.
Sure.
It's the workers and other oppressed people, like the peasantry, but it's the workers and oppressed who have to suffer the consequences and foot the bill for the crisis of this system. We're seeing this now with austerity, which has been going for years, and it's only going to get worse, with being conscripted into fighting imperialist wars, into the reactionary anti-worker policies and attacks on democratic rights of the workers that capitalist states resort to in order to keep the system going. All of these things, I think we can all see they're having an impact on workers, young and old, particularly young people. But more and more people, working class people, are starting to question whether this is the only possible system. Why? Because they're being driven to by the constant hammer blow of events caused by this capitalist crisis, which Marx identified was not just, somebody made a mistake, somebody invested too much money on the wrong thing, that capitalist crises are an accident or the product of bad, immoral individuals. Capitalist crisis is an inherent part of the capitalist system. It's inescapable. This is something that Marx explained, and he's been confirmed as correct time after time. That also has an impact on the possibility of socialist revolution.
So another thing that the video presents, kind of as a gotcha, relates to this point about oppression. And the argument that Marx only thought about the working class. He didn't think about the oppression of, say, women or black people or gay people or what have you. First of all, is that true? Did Marx not comment on the oppression of any layer of society other than the working class? And two, is that a justifiable criticism of Marxism, that we don't take sufficient account of the many different ways that people can be oppressed, and we're only interested in the working class? Is that a flaw in our theory?
To answer the first question, no, it's not true, actually. Marx did write about other forms of oppression. He lived through, he didn't live in the United States of America, but he lived through the American Civil War, and he enthusiastically supported the cause of the abolition of slavery. And he wrote around that time that labour, meaning workers in a white skin, can never be free as long as labour in a black skin is branded, referring to the slaves. The white working class, the working class as a whole, can never win its liberation until the abolition of slavery. He also talked about oppression within the family. It's not the majority of its writing, but it doesn't have to be. The fact is that Marx and Engels, his close friend and collaborator, were very much aware of the oppression that women faced and face in society and in the family.
Well, Engels wrote probably the definitive text on the question, The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, which shows where the oppression of women comes from and how it's linked to the emergence of class society and in turn to the emergence of the state.
Yeah, and he didn't say, it doesn't matter, or it's identical with class. But what he explained in that work, which, by the way, the inspiration for that work came from notes of Marx's that Engels discovered after Marx's death. So Marx was looking into this question as well. It's not that Engels was correcting a gap in Marx's analysis. What Engels explained in that work is that the oppression of women, the position of women as almost in slave-like conditions in many societies, as being the property of men or being second-class citizens, is something that arises along with the division of society into classes. He's not saying that the oppression of women is identical to the exploitation of the working class or exploitation of other classes in ancient forms of society. But he's saying that those two are actually bound up with each other, bound up with private property, bound up with class exploitation and oppression. But the thing that I find extremely inspiring about that Marxist analysis of the oppression of women is it identifies that it has an origin and therefore it has an end. Again, dialectically, something that so many people take to be just an inherent part of human life. That men are on average larger and more aggressive, and therefore they dominate women in one way or another. That is something that we can never escape from, basically. That is an idea challenged by Marxist materialist analysis, and actually Marxism points to a way in which men and women can be truly equal, not just legally equal, which is obviously something very much worth fighting for, but equal in fact, equal in life, that women can be completely economically, socially independent from men, which not all women are today, even in the most advanced capitalist countries, and that men and women and all people are able to live freely and develop themselves to the highest degree. That is what communism is about, and Marx and Engels recognized that from the beginning.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that it's related to this criticism that appears in the Crash Course video, that they don't talk about overproduction, capitalist crisis, for example, but they do talk a lot about alienation, which isn't something that Marx goes into a huge amount of depth about in his writings. It is an important concept, but they seem to imply that the reason that workers struggle is because they're miserable, that they're sad, they're unhappy, they're stuck in these degrading, boring, dangerous, unfulfilling jobs, and they're not given enough money, and at a certain point they become alienated enough that they simply have to go out into the streets and do something about it. That's the way that class struggle and working class revolution is explained in the Crash Course video, and it seems to be related to something that you imply in making this comparison with Marx's writings on class. They treat class as just one more form of identity, one more way that your life can be rubbish. It can be rubbish because you're black, because you're a woman, because you're gay, and because you're a worker, and all those things exist on the same plane. But what do we say about that?
And this relates to the second part of the question you asked before as well, so I'd be glad to try and bring these together. That Marx did write about the oppression of women, for instance, but he didn't place the class struggle, class exploitation, oppression side by side with the oppression of women or the oppression of black people as just different categories of oppression that are all self-contained and equal to one another, and that all require a separate movement, or all have to be basically catalogued as part of a progressive struggle. For Marx, class is fundamental. Class isn't simply an identity. Obviously, as a worker, you will have a certain identity and you will have your experience of living as a worker. But that's not what Marx is talking about. Marx is talking about the creation and development of a class and the impact it has on society as a whole. So Marx identifies the struggle of the working class for its emancipation as the key driving force for the emancipation of all of humanity. And I think that's probably why people then attack him, saying you don't care about the struggle against women's oppression. That's not true. That's a false argument being made and a misrepresentation. What Marx is saying is that the racism that we see in the world today, the oppression, the violence against women, the position of women in the home, all of these different forms of oppression that are regularly talked about in politics, these are linked to the mode of production that we live under, linked to a system. It's not just nasty people do nasty things. It is that these things play a role in the social system that we live under.
What sort of role do they play?
Well, I guess it depends on what we're talking about. But the racism, which also has an historical origin, linked to the development of capitalism, has been used deliberately and explicitly many times to divide workers against themselves.
So it's divide and rule, essentially.
That's one aspect of it, a very important aspect of it, that there have been times in history where, say, the US ruling class, the British ruling class, have deliberately tried to prevent unified action between white workers and black workers or migrant workers, because they understand that if there is a section of the population that is, if you like, separated off from the other and treated as inferior, that there's been times when they brought migrant labour in as strike breakers, for instance, or you were able to basically just pay them lower wages. And at the same time, on the political stage, capitalist politicians can say it's not the capitalists, it's not the bosses that are the problem. It's these immigrants coming and taking the jobs. They don't live the way that we live. They work for less. They're undermining our conditions of work. And we see in politics today how successful and how divisive that can be. The truth is that if the working class were united across all racial and national lines, capitalism probably wouldn't last a week, once the working class was mobilized to overthrow the system. And so racism can never and will never be eradicated under capitalism. But it's not correct to say that it can never be eradicated from all of human society forever. Likewise, women's oppression, the double oppression that women experience under capitalism, is useful for a number of reasons under capitalism, and exploiting whatever chauvinist prejudices national chauvinism or sexist prejudices that sections of the population have. By the way, it doesn't all come from the working class, as the middle class media constantly claims that racism is a product of ignorant white workers. That's not at all the case. When you look into the history of it, it comes from well-heeled members of the ruling class who propagate it in their newspapers. The working class don't own the Daily Mail. It's members of the ruling class who are propagating the ideas.
Certainly wasn't the working class that funded the rise of Nazi Germany, for example. It was the industrialists who threw behind Hitler and the Nazis as a bulwark against communism, endorsing all of his racist policies and so on.
Exactly. So, I mean, that's a great point, because here we see that national chauvinism, kind of what's called as traditionalist ideas about the role of women in the family and stuff like that, racism, are all things that the ruling class can use quite effectively to rally a wider section of the population around itself. Because let's face it, the ruling class are a minority. The staggering levels of inequality don't make them particularly relatable. And it's quite possible that under these conditions of crisis, with growing poverty and insecurity, a wider and wider layer of the population, the working class, will think, maybe these guys are the problem, maybe these guys are the enemy. But when you have capitalist politicians coming out and saying, we have to defend our nation against encroachments from this evil leader or this evil country, or we have to defend ourselves from this influx of drug dealers from over the Mexican border, for instance, and stuff like that. It's an attempt by either members of the ruling class or the parties and the ruling class collectively to gain a wider social base. Mm-hmm. And so one of the fronts in the class struggle is being able to break through these illusions. And one thing I would say is, if you look at the history of the working class, yes, prejudices can exist within the working class. How could that not be the case? They don't originate in the working class, but crucially, in periods of struggle, there are countless examples of workers reaching out to workers of other ethnicities, other nationalities, common action and struggle between women workers and male workers for a common end, for their mutual liberation. That's not because they've read Marx or read any other theorist that's told them, oh, you should fight against racism. It's because they've seen it's in their common interest. Mm-hmm. And again, going back to materialism, how the experience of the class struggle changes people's ideas. They're not born with exactly the same ideas that they die with. Mm. And that also, by itself, has revolutionary implications. So as I said before, racism, sexism, all these things are necessary for capitalism. They are actually a part of the capitalist system. They've grown up with it. Sexism predates capitalism, but they are a necessary part of the system. If we are going to eradicate these things, then we have to get rid of capitalism. So the next question is, how do we get rid of capitalism? That's why Marx focuses on class. That's why we focus on class. And that's why it's absolutely right to focus on class. It's not to ignore or say, oh, don't worry about your oppression. You basically just shut up and wait for the workers to carry it out. Let's not forget that a large section of the working class, well, at least half of the workers are women, and a big section of the working class are from oppressed racial backgrounds. The point is that the only force on earth that can overthrow the capitalist system is the working class. Therefore, the struggle, the utmost unity, the highest level of class consciousness, and the revolutionary struggle of the working class to seize power and transform society is fundamental. It is the most important thing if we really want to solve these problems.
Well, that leads us into another question that the Crash Course video raises, which is whether revolution is really necessary or desirable, and whether there are other alternatives for dealing with the problems in society. They draw on the example of cooperatives. They draw, for example, on the Spanish cooperative company Mondragon. So I did a little bit of research into Mondragon, and while it's true that on average it does provide better wages and better working conditions to its employees than other more traditionally run private companies, it's by no means a utopia. It has workers from overseas who are on lower wages and have inferior conditions to workers employed in the Spanish state. It used to have a big white goods division that was its main international operation, but it fell apart. It had to declare bankruptcy because of the impact of the 2008 financial crisis and also because of international competition. And also, it's not as though Mondragon is devoid of some of the problems you see in other capitalist companies, because, for example, there have been strikes at Mondragon warehouses, particularly strikes that originate from those international workers who don't get the same benefits and conditions as workers from the Spanish states. And part of the reason I was interested in looking into this is because I also, at one time in my life, worked for a cooperative. I worked for John Lewis, which is technically a cooperative, insofar as everybody who becomes an employee of John Lewis, which, if you don't know, is a big department store group in the UK, gets a share of the company, and at least technically the right to participate in certain board meetings and in certain decisions. But what it meant in practice was that I owned about 0.000000001% of John Lewis, and my 9 to 5 working in the restaurant was exactly the same as it would have felt if I was working for Tesco or Asda or any other company, any other department store, any other shop under British capitalism. So functionally, it was exactly the same. But this question of cooperatives, of worker-owned companies as an alternative to both capitalism in its traditional form and revolution, it is something that has been presented as a possibility, that's been experimented with and considered by Marx and Engels, also Lenin. So what is our general objection to the idea of cooperatives? Why do cooperatives not offer an alternative to revolution? Why do we remain revolutionaries?
Right, yeah, because I don't object to the existence of cooperatives or workers joining cooperatives. What I object to, and what Marx objected to, is the idea that you can gradually reform away the evils of capitalism through the spread of cooperatives, which is a very common idea in Marx's day. And actually, the cooperative movement in Britain was very popular at one point within the working class. You know, today in Britain we have something called the cooperative group. You can see it at supermarkets, they provide other services, and it has its origin in that cooperative movement, the idea that, well, workers will sell goods at reasonable prices to each other. But I think anybody living in Britain and listening to this will know that the co-op operates like any other supermarket. And this comes to the point that capitalism is a social system which has certain laws. We talked a bit about overproduction, the necessity of exploiting the working class. So if you're a company that distributes its profits, first you have to make profits. And in order to make profits, you have to sell cheaply on the market and keep your costs of production down. And so that's why Mondragon, whilst presenting itself as this pro-worker company, is outsourcing its exploitation to other countries because it can do it cheaper. Just like every other company on earth. If you are going to play the game, if you like, you have to play by its rules. And so the idea that you can reform the evils of capitalism away by participating in the capitalist market is just, it will just cause the endless repetition of those evils. It doesn't mean that, you know, if it's the same as bosses who are kinder to the workers versus bosses that are horrible. That doesn't transform the system, does it?
No.
The key, what Marx said, Marx wasn't opposed to co-ops in general. He made a very interesting comment that said that for cooperatives not to be a sham and a snare, a trap, as they were under capitalism, he said, you would have to overthrow the capitalist state and actually have a planned economy.
Yes.
So in other words, if you get rid of the market and the laws of the market and the need to produce profitably and just have the democratically planned production of society's needs by the working class collectively, then organising workplaces on a cooperative basis is a genuine form of workers' management. Lenin, while he was near the end of his life, was thinking about how cooperatives could be integrated into the building of socialism. So cooperatives in the future could well have a progressive purpose, but the idea that they can provide an alternative to capitalism or an alternative to revolution is false, which has been proven by the outcome of the cooperative movement that we see today.
Yeah, I mean, Engels wrote extensively and in a very complimentary way about the great Robert Owen, who was one of the most important figures in the British labour movement, who was attempting to the best extent that he could, without the benefits of decades of class struggle that followed and the ideas of Marxism, for example, to create a better mode of life for workers. He was himself a capitalist. He was a wealthy industrialist. He owned a series of mills, and he tried to run them on cooperative lines. He tried to build model villages around his mills, around his workplaces and factories. He experimented with cooperatives in Scotland, in the United States, and for a certain period of time, he was the most famous and beloved man in Britain because he was regarded as this great Christian philanthropist. But he came to realise instinctively that the only reason that his workers had a better deal was because he subjectively happened to think they should. And if he was to change his mind, then they'd be at his mercy. And he was groping towards, without ever really reaching, groping towards the fact that it's not down to the subjective will of a given capitalist. The system of capitalism itself, which, as you say, relies upon competition to produce things as cheaply and efficiently as possible to maximize profits, will always put the screws on workers' wages and conditions. That's how capitalists outcompete one another. When he understood that, he moved in a more radical direction and he started toying with communistic ideas. And at that point, he was ostracized from the high society of British life. And also all of his operations, all of his experiments, all of his business holdings failed. And he ended up essentially penniless and greatly demoralized by the experience. And this is a heroic and genuine attempt to find a route to providing workers at a relatively early point in the development of capitalism with a better mode of life, but without actually breaking from the underlying logic of the system and establishing workers' power. In Robert Owen's defense, we're talking, the early 1800s. He wasn't exposed to the kind of advanced ideas, and the working class wasn't sufficiently developed, really. The labour movement wasn't sufficiently developed for him to necessarily draw the correct conclusions, but he did run into a wall, and Engels comments on this when talking about why revolution is indeed necessary if workers are to be guaranteed a decent and dignified existence. So in fairness, the video only provides one example of an attempt to reform this system. But surely there are other ways. Is there no way of reforming this system that wouldn't require a total break from it?
Well, in the history of the last 200 years, there have been lots of movements to reform in one way or another. And the workers have won some improvements. They've won restrictions on the working day, higher wages. They've won the vote, of course. And that, understandably, can give the impression that, well, if we just keep fighting, then eventually all the things we don't like, all the bad things about capitalism will be whittled away. But I think living today, we can see the limits of that. That, first of all, capitalism is not this endlessly expanding, wealth-creating system that it's presented as by the liberals. It's a crisis-ridden, anarchic system in which whole parts of the world are, dragged into economic and social crisis with mass unemployment and where many of the gains of the past are pulled back. I mean, speaking about Britain, for the last, ever since Thatcher, even before I was born, the ruling class and the state have been trying to peel back the reforms that have been won by the working class in the past. The working class has not moved forward in its position, in its conditions for decades. And now, living under austerity, you see that the crumbling of the healthcare system, of education, of the desperate conditions people are living in. This is because the system demands that the cost of the crisis be placed on the working class. So we're constantly going to be trapped in this, this constant back and forth. But to make matters worse, even then, capitalism itself is a sinking ship. It's not just that it periodically enters into crises and then it gets better again. That we're seeing with things like climate change, or the fact that we've been in this economic crisis for now, since 2008, basically. The depth of the crisis, the fact that the system has not been able to drag itself out of it, the increasing tensions between countries, the increase in protectionism, all of these things point to an even worse future under capitalism. So trying to reform, to identify, oh, well, this specific thing, let's try and get rid of that, it feels like trying to rearrange deck chairs on the Titanic. There's another really important question that I want to raise here, which is the nature of the capitalist state itself. How do we reform the evils out of the system? Presumably, it would be we elect a party that stands for nice things and getting rid of the bad things about capitalism, and then it carries out a legislative reform agenda. We've seen lots of attempts to do that. In Colombia, they have a left-wing president who is trying to reform certain quite big problems in Colombian society. And he's coming up against the limits of even his own coalition and the very structure of the Colombian parliament, basically. In Britain, you had somebody like Corbyn who wasn't even enabled to come to power. They threw everything they had. If he had come to power, do we think that the tops of the state bureaucracy and the banks would just let him do whatever he wanted? The fact is that we live in a social system that, first of all, has its own laws, the laws of the market, the necessity of exploitation, which means the impact on conditions that we see, that it's a crisis-ridden system, but also the whole so-called democratic political structures that we're supposed to use, the instrument that we're supposed to reform the society with, are in the hands of the enemy and are going to be twisted and distorted and ultimately used to put the workers back in their box. That is what the history of the class struggle under capitalism shows us. So the conclusion that Marx drew explicitly is, and I'm quoting from memory, but he more or less explicitly said that the working class cannot simply lay their hands on the ready-made, pre-existing state machinery and use it for their own purposes to identify certain evils that they want to get rid of. The working class has to take hold of state power, dismantle it, this oppressive state apparatus, and build their own state, their own political organization to do what? To transform society and the economy in accordance with their needs. And that means planning the economy, making sure that the health service and education has the funds it has, providing for the needs of society in a planned way. That would be a social revolution. By the way, that social revolution would take the form of a number of reforms, but you cannot get those reforms without the working class taking power. That is the revolution that we need.
And I think that leads quite nicely to the end of the Crash Course video. And I think at this point we should probably offer our thanks to Crash Course because even though we took some issues with the way that they presented quite literally everything about about Marx's ideas, we agree that Marx haunts the minds of the reactionaries and the capitalists and the bourgeois like a spectre. And it's because these ideas are very powerful and they really do describe the world and they continue to inspire. But there's a couple of things that I wanted to end with. First of all, our comrades make a cameo in this video.
This old German philosopher's name is still in the mouths of right-wing pundits and socialist activists alike, thrown around as a political buzzword to ruffle feathers.
We make a couple of cameos, as a matter of fact. And the implication seems to be that the only reason that you would talk about Marxism, you would raise Marx's ideas, is to get a rise out of people, to be a bit of an iconoclast, to be a bit provocative. Is that the attitude that this organization takes to Marx's ideas?
No, absolutely not. And yeah, I take issue with presenting our comrades and saying, oh, people are just throwing out Marx's face or his name to get a reaction. When communists use the name or the image of Marx, what they're getting at there is talking about his set of ideas as something that we can explain the world with and understand the world with now. The way the video presents things is that Marx had some interesting ideas, but he's dead now, and there were gaps in his theory that academics today are filling in much better. So we don't need to talk about him. The only reason we're talking about him is because the right wing wants to shock you and the left wing wants to shock you. Capitalism is more shocking. The truth of capitalism, the reality of capitalism today is much more shocking, frankly, than anything Marx had to say. And what we are doing is we are pointing to that truth. And the reason we hold up Marx, we hold up his name, we hold up his ideas, is because they are the best tool, I would say the only tool, that working class people have today to understand why we are living through this crisis. And not only that, not just study it academically, but actually to give us a way to take control of our fate, a way to end this crisis for humanity and actually start building a society fit for humanity. That's why you see young people in particular, but not only young people, enthusiastically holding up pictures of Marx or using the image of the hammer and sickle. It's because it represents the future for them, the only future worth fighting for.
And I also want to emphasize that we do not treat Marx's ideas in a light-minded way. We study them thoroughly, and we really try to engage with the essence of Marxist theory, because it's our sword and our shield. It's the way that we not only understand the world, as you say, but, as Marx wrote, to change it. His criticism of philosophy hitherto was that it had only interpreted the world in various ways, whereas the point was to change it. And these are the only ideas in this day and age capable of changing the world. And I hope that this discussion, and I hope that all the episodes we produce in the course of this podcast, and all the material that we produce on Marxist.com, in the In Defense of Marxism magazine, which Josh edits, all of the material we put out across all of our channels goes to show that we take these ideas extremely seriously, and we want you to take them seriously. We want you to engage with them. That's why we created this show. That's why we have a website. That's why we publish our papers all over the world. And that's why we invite anybody who's inspired by these ideas to join us, because the conclusion that has to flow from studying Marx's ideas is that this society is rotten. This system, this capitalist system, has played out its usefulness to humanity, and you can't possibly change anything on your own. You have to be organized. You have to be organized on the basis of the correct ideas. So if you agree with what we've said, then please do reach out. We have a presence in over 60 countries, so get involved and join us in the struggle for a better future for humanity. Josh, one more time, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks very much, Joe.
And I'll see you all next week. Ta-ra.
A spectre is haunting Europe. The spectre of communism.
Communism is stronger, more determined than ever.
Dedicated to the establishment of a new order.
Just what is communism?
I'll guarantee that 10 minutes from now, a lot of you are going to have a new understanding of communism.